The New Orleans Saints are trying their best to build a roster that's built for success, but what will that roster look like? It's time for a 53-man roster projection. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day, whether it's your first time or your next time. Know that we appreciate you very much for being here. And of course, if you want to keep the conversation going one-on-one with me, and you could also take a part of our exclusive film studies, Q&As, inside information, early access, and much more, you can head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints to join a community I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media. You can find me as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site, covering the New Orleans Saints every single Tuesday on the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday, and then some on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Once again, that's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, it's a 53-man roster projection, but we're doing it a little bit differently. I'm doing it the way that I think an NFL team would most be likely to look at it, as opposed to the way that we in the media kind of teach you to look at a 53-man roster. So instead of going position by position, we're looking at the starters. Then we're going to look at the depth, and then we're going to look at the special teams talent. This is the way that a team would fill out its roster. Who are your 22, 23 starters, depending upon how you're counting, and then who are going to be your guys that are going to back those guys up, and then who are those final 46 to 53 spots that are going to be headed to special teams or large special teams roles. So we're going to start off with the offense today because, or the starting offense to kick this off, because the team is really impressive when it comes to the starters. If you're trying to build a team to win, this is a pretty good blueprint on how to do it, especially coming from where the New Orleans Saints were last year. Starting with the offense, this is easy. Quarterback Derek Carr, simple. Nothing more to discuss there. At running back, you know that Alvin Kamara is going to be the guy, but he's suspended for the first 3 games of the season, so he's not actually going to count against the 53-man roster, with that being the case. So we've got Jamal Williams as your starter at running back. We're going to get to the depth guys that are going to fold into all this here in just a little bit, but I'm focusing on the big names right now. Fullback, Adam Prentice. I think the New Orleans Saints continue to go with fullbacks. Tight end, I think your number one guy is Juwan Johnson, but you're going to have a really good core of tight ends. Your top 3 wide receivers, this is simple. Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, lock, and lock. And then your other locks are going to be your guys over on the offensive line. I don't know if this is necessarily how the starters are going to pan out, but this is how I think they should pan out based on what we've seen so far over the course of the offseason. Left tackle, Trevor Penning. Left guard, James Hurst. That's where I shake things up a little bit. Center, Eric McCoy. Right guard, Cesar Ruiz. Right tackle, Ryan Ramczyk. No big shakeups on the offense. You know what this offense is going to look like. I'm just putting right now James Hurst ahead of Andrus Peat because James Hurst has been A, available, B, impressive. Let's jump over to the starting defense here, starting on the defensive line. Cam Jordan on one side of the line. In the interior, Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard. And then Carl Granderson is your bookend opposite Cam Jordan. I think Carl Granderson has earned that, but let's not sleep on Peyton Turner. He's going to be a big-time rotational piece. Linebackers, sticking with a nickel formation here. We're going to go Demario Davis and Pete Werner as your 2 starting linebackers. I know that there have been some people who have been out there kind of speculating this idea that Jalen Smith is going to lead Pete Werner as the starting linebacker. That's not going to happen. Pete Werner was one of the NFL's top linebackers while he was healthy at the beginning of last season. He will maintain his role as a starter next to Demario Davis. That's also been evidenced by first-team reps during practice. Your starting corners going from the outside to your slot corner, Marshawn Lattimore on one side. I've still got Paulson Adebo with the edge on the other side, and then Bradley Roby in the slot. Safeties, Tyrann Mathieu. And then I'm going to have Marcus May on the roster, but I'm assuming that he's going to be suspended for the first 3 games of the season and therefore will not count against the 53-man roster. So I've got Jordan Howden, the rookie, stepping into a starting role there. So far during training camp, anytime that we've seen Tyrann Mathieu get a Vets Day rest, Jordan Howden is playing his role. Anytime that Marcus May is getting a vet day of rest, Jordan Howden is playing his role. So that's sort of what I expect to see right now would be Jordan Howden stepping into that role for the first 3 games. But they'll have a lot of solid safeties on this roster that they'll be able to kind of shake things up and shake things in a little bit. So we have a total of 12 players or 23 players already off the board here, only because I went the extra step of having the fullback as well as 3 wide receivers. That's why it comes out to 23 instead of 22. So that's me looking at a 2-back set with Jamal Williams and Adam Prentice, but then also including your top 3 wide receivers in Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, and Rashid Shaheed. So what I love about this starting role or the starting depth chart for the New Orleans Saints is that they have talent at every position. It's undeniable. Whether you're looking at running back without Alvin Kamara, Jamal Williams, who led the NFL with 17 touchdowns last year, he's your guy. Derek Carr is your starting quarterback. There's no debate around that. Your offensive line, the starting offensive line, very solid, very good. We certainly saw that during that first possession during the first preseason game. Can they stay healthy is going to be the biggest question mark. Same thing when it comes to the starting wide receivers. Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, all having dealt with injury each of the past 2 seasons. Michael Thomas, of course, only 10 games played over the course of the last 3 seasons. We saw Rashid Shaheed come into the NFL with an injury. Now he's been off the board for a bit since I think it's been practice day 9, if I remember correctly, where he left with a groin injury same day as Traquan Smith. We haven't seen him return to action. However, we have seen him around the team. We've seen him travel. He was in Costa Mesa. He was on the sideline in Los Angeles during the Chargers game. All good news. And Chris Olave, of course, was dealing with some soft tissue stuff early during OTAs, a little bit during camp, but everything's been okay there. But health is going to be the biggest question mark. But if all these guys are playing and if all these guys are on the field, it's going to be a very, very good offense here in 2023, or should be a very, very good offense here in 23. The defense is mostly the same. Not a lot of changes from last season. Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson, those guys return. You got Carl Granderson stepping into a top spot, right? A starting spot instead of Marcus Davenport or in place of Marcus Davenport. You've got guys like Colin Saunders, as well as, of course, Nathan Shepard that are coming in and replacing players like Shai Tuttle and David Onyemata. But outside of that, Demario Davis, Pete Werner, same starting 2 from last season. Marshawn Lattimore, Paulson Adebo, Bradley Roby, Tyrann Mathieu, all 4 of the intended starting 5 from last year. Marcus May would be there too, unless he's suspended to open up the season, and you have the rookie and Jordan Howden potentially stepping in there. So really, really good starting units for both the offense and the defense. A lot of talent at the top, but now the question is, what does the depth look like? And one of the biggest questions remains at quarterback. What to do with Jameis Winston? I'll tell you what I'm going to do with Jameis Winston on my 53-man roster projection, and what I believe the New Orleans Saints should do when they make this decision as well, as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at Bird Dogs. These are my absolute favorites. I've got 2 pairs of joggers. I've got like 4 or 5 pairs of shorts. I've got the hat that I wear out at training camp. Those of you that saw me at training camp saw me rocking it. I love this sort of athleisure approach that Bird Dogs has taken on in a way that just elevates everything. They've even got stretch khaki shorts that fit you perfectly, that kind of give you the sculpt that you're looking for. They look a little bit more dressy, even though they're very, very comfortable, all that. It's basically the exact same thing you're going to get from Lululemon, except way better. So not at all the same thing you're going to get from Lululemon. So go ahead and check them out today. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code LockedOnNFL for a free white tech hat with your order. It's the hat you see me wearing all the time at training camp. Once again, that's birddogs, plural, .com/LockedOnNFL, or use promo code LockedOnNFL for that free white tech hat. And you won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you that. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. We've got our first 23 down. Now let's take a look at filling out the depth behind the starters that we just discussed on offense and defense. And one of the big question marks is, what should the New Orleans Saints do with Jameis Winston? I'm going to give you my answer. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints to all your everydayers out there, your first listen of the day every day. And I thank you very much. If you are a returning listener or a first-time listener, it means the world to me. Thank you for checking out the show, and hope that you'll stick around because it's going to be very, very exciting as the season gets started. So as we start with the depth on the offensive side, I do have the New Orleans Saints keeping Jameis Winston, and I think they should keep Jameis Winston. I know that Jake Haener has been a ton of fun and that Jake Haener has quickly turned the corner and has quickly transitioned and is one of those guys that looks like he's going to translate to the NFL and be a long time backup quarterback, maybe get a starting role at some point. We'll see. But if nothing else, he's going to be like feels like he's a guy that's going to be like a 10-year veteran depth guy. You know what I mean? And that's fantastic. A Chase Daniel, a Luke McCown, those types of guys that we've seen excel here in New Orleans and contribute, even not as players or on the field, but contributing to championship teams or championship runs or playoff teams, however you want to look at it, in terms of their work and relationship with their starting quarterback. I do think that eventually Jake Haener, as early as next year, steps into that primary number 2 role. However, I think that Jameis Winston holds that role right now and should. It's simple. I know that there are people who don't like Jameis Winston, who don't like Jameis Winston as a quarterback. I get it. Ideally, you never see Jameis Winston nor Jake Haener on the field for the New Orleans Saints because we finally should see the New Orleans Saints getting back to the days to where their starting quarterback plays all the games. That's what you want to see from Derek Carr. What you want out of Jameis Winston, though, is a backup quarterback who knows the system, has won in the system, has won in the NFL, has played in the NFL, and knows what a defense looks like at the next level and how to have that conversation with Derek Carr on the sideline. Let Jake Haener witness that as the emergency third quarterback on the roster, which means he won't count against the game day roster, but he will count against the 53-man roster. So he does still take up a spot here. Let him learn from that, learn how to do it, and then assume that role next year while Jameis goes off and finds another role somewhere else with another team this offseason, one that he deserves. So I've got both Jameis Winston and Jake Haener still making the roster here for the New Orleans Saints. Once again, just to repeat it, the emergency third quarterback rule only applies to the game day roster. It means that the New Orleans Saints will be able to have Jake Haener plus 46 players active for the game day roster, but he still counts against the 53-man roster. In fact, it's a requirement that emergency third quarterback must be on your 53-man roster. Can't be on the practice squad. Now, let's take a look at the running back depth. Remember, we've got Alvin Kamara suspended right now for the first 3 games of the season, so he doesn't count. We already established Jamal Williams as our starter. So instead, in addition to them, we're going to add Kendre Miller and Ellis Merriweather. For me, Ellis Merriweather still has a little bit of an edge. I know that Darrell Williams comes in with a lot of experience, but I really like what we've seen from Ellis Merriweather and think that he can be one of those undrafted free agents to crack the roster this year. Tight ends, Foster Moreau, Jimmy Graham. Look, if Jimmy Graham's going to be back on the field today, which is what we were told by Dennis Allen is possible, and that they expect him to be back out there, and that whatever happened with him medically in Costa Mesa won't be a long-term issue or isn't an issue, then that means that Jimmy Graham is probably going to make this roster. I've said it from the moment that they signed him, and I know a lot of folks believe in Lucas Krull and all that. I think he's going to be a great practice squad guy, but still has a lot to be able to continue to add upon. If you're looking at either having a pass catcher in Lucas Krull or having a pass catcher in Jimmy Graham, I'm going to take the pass catcher in Jimmy Graham. If we were looking at Lucas Krull as a further developed blocker, that could make the difference, but I don't think that we've seen enough of that yet. So for me, Jimmy Graham, Foster Moreau, those are your 2 big-time guys that are behind Juwan Johnson. I know what you're thinking. I left somebody out. No, I didn't. Just give me a second. Wide receivers, I've actually got the Saints keeping 6 because I was able to fill this out the way that I wanted to. Get all the starters, get all of the depth players, get all of the core special teamers, then go back and plug players in. So that's how I got a 6 wide receiver here. A.T. Perry, Keith Kirkwood, Shaq Davis. Yeah, I did it. What are you going to do about it? You're going to be happy about it, I bet, because I know that you like Shaq Davis too. Look, I'm a big fan of Shaq Davis. I like big fan of Shaq Davis's game, rather. I like what Shaq Davis has been able to do. I'm pulling for him too as an HBCU guy trying to crack a 53-man roster. I mean, come on. And there's a lot of talent coming out of those ranks. And I think Shaq Davis is one of those prime examples of a guy that can make an NFL roster. We've seen him contribute as working on the punt block team, on the kick return team, on the kick coverage team, on the punt coverage team. We've seen it all. And so I really love all of that because look, if you're the 6 wide receiver on the roster, which would be this case, you're not keeping your 6 wide receiver as somebody that's going to go out there and play, right? You look at a guy like Marquez Callaway, who was effectively the 6 wide receiver on the roster last year, played less than like 320 or right around 320 snaps throughout the entire season, like 27% of snaps. That's what you're looking at over on the offensive side. So you're not keeping them just because, oh, he made some great catches during the preseason. He's got to be able to show that he can contribute in special teams too. And I think we've seen that so far. He spoke to it as well when we spoke to him on Tuesday, yesterday. And he seemed pretty much like, yeah, this is definitely a role that I would be glad to fill. Offensive line, I've got the Saints keeping 4 in the back. Andrus Peat, who gives you a great guard, tackle, swing, backup player. That's where I think he should be. Just like, and if not, if he's starting, then James Hurst, of course, is there. Nick Saldiveri, again, guard, tackle, swing on either side. I'm going with Tommy Kramer. Tommy Kramer has played over 70 snaps this preseason, has not allowed a single pressure, has played at both guard and at center. So I like being able to potentially plug him in at center behind Eric McCoy. And then I'm going to have them keeping Lewis Kidd because I just think that they really like Lewis Kidd, and I think that that makes perfect sense. But somewhere in there, there's Calvin Throckmorton. Maybe Landon Young comes back from his injury in time. All those other things. Like there's a lot of guys that can end up sliding into one of those spots. And then as your offensive weapon, Taysom Hill, who does a little bit of everything. See, promised you I didn't forget about him. All right, so that gets us up to 37 on the roster. Let's get up to 46. Defense, really nothing surprising here. Your depth on the defensive line at defensive end, you've got Peyton Turner, you've got Isaiah Foskey. Those are going to be your guys. Tano Passanio is in there as well as your guy that's, can contribute on the edge, but can also contribute in the middle. So he's kind of bridging the gap. And then on the inside, Malcolm Roach. And then, of course, rookie Brian Brzee. This isn't really about an order at all. This is just the order that I wrote them down in. All of these guys are going to get playing time. All of them are going to get starts throughout this season, depending on the matchup, all that other stuff. You're going to see a lot of all 5 of those guys in addition to the 4 starters that we mentioned in the last segment. When it comes to linebacker, I've got the 2 backups, Jalen Smith, who is your backup off-ball linebacker, and then Zach Bond, who's your strong side linebacker, who also bridges the gap with the special teams guys as well. I do want to acknowledge that. And then they want to see what Jalen Smith is going to be able to do on special teams as well. I don't think that his ability to play special teams will be, or I don't think that his ability to make the roster will be contingent upon his ability to play in special teams, but I think they want to know what can you do in special teams, and does that mean they need to keep an extra linebacker? Remember that. At cornerback, your backup, Alante Taylor, nice and easy. At safety, your core backup, assuming that Marcus May is suspended at the beginning of the season, so Jordan Howden is the starter for you, Lonnie Johnson Jr. I could also see Lonnie Johnson Jr. starting and Jordan Howden being the backup, but either way, you can kind of see where that would go. So that gets us up to 46. Spots 47 through 53, we're going all special teams. Who are the guys that are going to be contributing majorly to special teams? Well, there's a lot of talent in that room again here in New Orleans. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster and for free. You know that every time, especially when you're a small business, every single one of these hires feels like a high stakes wager. So you want to be 100% certain that you're getting the best qualified candidates possible. That's where LinkedIn Jobs helps big time, because you can go ahead and post your job and then you can add the purple hashtag hiring frame to your organization's website or your organization's LinkedIn page to help spread the word. Then you get access to simple tools like screening questions so that you can easily focus on the candidates that have the requisite skills and experience that you want, so you can prioritize those that are going to be most beneficial for you to interview right away. This is all amongst the many reasons that small businesses rank LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality candidates versus leading competitors. So you want to check them out. You want to be heading over to LinkedIn Jobs. They're going to help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints, our 53-man roster projection, doing a little bit differently, not going position by position, but instead looking at starters, which we named our top 23 there. Looked at depth, which got us up to 46, so another 23 there. And then now we've got spots 47 through 53 left to build out our special teams core of players. So we can get 3 out of the way right away when it comes to the kicker, punter, long snapper. I'm still rolling with Will Lutz, Blake Gillikin, and of course Zach Woods. Zach Woods probably the safest of the 3, right? But look, the Saints did bring in some legitimate competition. Blake Grupe's done a fantastic job over the course of the offseason. I also think Lou Hedley's done really well too. I do think that maybe Will Lutz has a little bit more of a lead on Blake Grupe than Blake Gillikin has on Lou Hedley. So I'd keep an eye out on that, especially this last week and going into this last preseason game. But look, there's a lot of things that factor in here. If Blake Grupe and the Saints, if Blake Grupe continues to do what he's doing and the Saints feel really comfortable for him and they feel like they can get a draft pick for a trade of Will Lutz, they might entertain doing it. And why wouldn't you, right? Or vice versa. But I don't think you're going to get a draft pick in a trade from Blake Grupe. I think you would get one from Will Lutz because Will Lutz has actually kicked in the NFL regular season before. So obviously that would make a big difference. And he's hit several game winners, several 60-plus yarders, all those other things. I think that those are the things that end up making it to where maybe you can get a six-round pick or something like that out of Sean Payton, perhaps, over in Denver to get him. Otherwise, Dennis Allen's calling up his old buddy, Sean Payton, much like years ago, Harbaugh called up his old buddy, Sean Payton, and said, hey, keep an eye out. This guy, Will Lutz, is really good. Dennis could do the same thing for Sean and call him up and be like, hey, keep an eye out for Blake Grupe. He's really, really good. You should call him up. So that's the way that I look at it right now. I'm rolling with the incumbents for now, but we're going to look at another roster projection after the final game. Hopefully get ahead of some of the roster cuts in the process to be able to kind of see, okay, who do we think now is going to make that roster? That'll be kind of the final 53-man roster projection. For the other core special teamers who are going to be adding to the defensive side of the football, I've got 4. And this is going to wrap us up through the 53-man roster. JT Gray, who can't be left out at all, right? He's your core. He's your best special teamer. He's your best gunner. He's one of your best coverage players as a whole when it comes to special teams, kick or punt, and is a solid depth player at safety as well. So I think that he's one. For everything that I just said, except not a solid depth player at safety, but is a solid depth player at corner, Isaac Yiadom. He's another one that gets that spot. And in the last two, safety Ugo Amadi. Come on, you knew I wasn't going to leave him off, right? You knew I wasn't going to not have Ugo Amadi make this roster. Number 0. Come on. Of course Ugo Amadi was making the roster. So we got Ugo Amadi there. And then I'm going to keep linebacker Ty Summers. I got my 6th wide receiver in Shaq Davis. I'm pretty happy about that. I got my 4th tight end with Taysom Hill and Jimmy Graham. So now the thing that I'm looking at is, can I get another guy in there that's going to be a core special teamer for me and maybe bolster a room? And that's where I think Ty Summers comes in. You've already got your starters when it comes to your linebackers in Demario Davis and Pete Werner. We added in some depth when it came to Jalen Smith and Zach Bond. Then I'm adding Ty Summers in. This is a little bit tough because what it means is that I have to try to get DeMarco Jackson to the practice squad. Now, if DeMarco Jackson proves to be a better special teamer than Ty Summers, then I could see DeMarco Jackson getting this spot. For right now, though, I got to kind of give the nod to Ty Summers because I'm not looking at just linebacker depth. I'm looking for a core special teamer. And when Ty Summers was signed by the New Orleans Saints last year, especially when they had all those injuries at linebacker, Caden Ellis stepped into a bigger role, so he wasn't as prevalent for you on special teams, although when he was out there, he still found ways to make plays on special teams, of course. Ty Summers stepped up big time, and we've seen him continue to step up here in New Orleans. And look, there's a couple of other guys that are going to end up contributing to special teams. Lonnie Johnson Jr. is absolutely one of them. Did a lot of special teams during his career, and he was a guy you look at just last week, helped down that punt at the 5, all those other things. Ugo Amadi showed you that he can cover. He can be he can cover in the slot. He can cover at safety. He can be a returner for you. He can be a gunner for you. A lot of different things that Ugo Amadi can do. So you know that he's up there and on that list as well as somebody that can be a special teams core guy, but also contribute for you. Shaq Davis is another one of those examples. And then, of course, your offensive line, defensive line helps out immensely in those situations as well. And Alontae Taylor. Alontae Taylor has been a very good special teamer when rolled out in that role as well. But I do think that Alontae Taylor and Paulson Adebo will probably rotate quite a bit throughout the 2023 season based on the matchup of the wide receiver. The fact of the matter is that both of those guys are getting out on the field. And it might not mean that Alontae Taylor is playing in the slot while Paulson Adebo is on the outside or vice versa, but you will see, I think, Alontae Taylor and Paulson Adebo rotate with each other all throughout the season. They did that with Norris Jenkins years ago. They've done it with PJ Williams. They did it in the slot. They did it with guys like Justin Evans as well as Chris Harris Jr. And then, of course, to start the season, Bradley Roby last year. Like, they really don't mind doing that, much like they rotate on their defensive line. So those are the big ones there. I don't really have any big names left off, I don't think, as I kind of looked at this and tried to look at, okay, so who are the toughest cuts that I had to make? I think some of the toughest cuts are guys that show a little bit of promise, right? Like Jontre Kirkland. I would love to see John Trey Kirkland, even though I don't have him on the 53-man roster projection, still end up on the practice squad. A guy like Lucas Kroll, get him to the practice squad. A guy like Lynn Bowden, get him to the practice squad. So I really do think that, and maybe even a veteran running back like Darrell Williams, if you can get him to the practice squad, get him to the practice squad, right? Like that would be massively helpful for this team to continue to do that. The other wrinkle that I'll throw in here as we wrap up comes down to the offensive line. I've got them keeping guys like Tommy Kramer, Lewis Kidd. I don't think Nick Saldiveri is going anywhere. You invested in him highly when it came to that 4th round draft pick. Obviously, Andrus Peat, James Hurst, they're not going anywhere. Your starters aren't going anywhere. But when it comes to guys like Tommy Kramer as well as Lewis Kidd, is there somebody that gets cut at roster cuts that the Saints feel like can be a better addition than the both of them, than either of them? So it could mean that they make the initial 53-man roster, but then end up being moved on from because the Saints were able to get another offensive lineman through waivers. So even though you're looking at an initial 53-man roster, this might not be the roster that they play with week 1. And the roster that they play with week 1 may not be the roster that they play with week 2. Because remember, after the first week of the NFL season, contracts that you sign with players are no longer guaranteed, and everybody is paid by their agreement based on game checks. So if you end up signing ahead of week 2, you only play 3 games, you're not costing the New Orleans Saints a full $1 million if you're a vet minimum. You're costing them those game checks, and that's it. So I think that that's the next piece that we would look at is where do you see some of the changes and some of the juggling that could happen? The other places, 2 other places where I could see some juggling happening here is that if Tre'Quan Smith is not going to be ready for the regular season, I could see the Saints letting Shaq Davis go to waivers, getting Tre'Quan Smith on the initial 53-man roster, moving Tre'Quan Smith to injured reserve, which would have him required to be out for at least the first 3 games, and then bring Shaq Davis onto the active roster. If he slides through waivers, which I think would be at least likely that would happen. It would be a well-calculated gamble by the New Orleans Saints to roll the dice on that. Similarly, Landon Young, they could do the same thing with him depending upon what his recovery time is. Have him make the active roster in place of, let's say, a Lewis Kidd or a Tommy Kramer, move him to injured reserve so he's required to be out for the first 3 weeks of the season, opens up that roster spot, and then Tommy Kramer, Lewis Kidd, whoever you want to bring back, comes back to the active roster, or that opens up your spot for the player that you add onto your offensive line from waivers. So there's a bunch of different ways that the Saints can go around kind of tinkering with all this with some, let's say, well-calculated gambles and short-term gambles, right? So there's a bunch of different ways they go about it. So that's our 53-man roster projection updated after the first 2 preseason games and several weeks of training camp. We'll try to squeeze one more in after the New Orleans Saints and Houston Texans play. That'll probably be a bonus episode for you that week so we can get it out quickly. And then we'll see what actually happens as those roster cuts begin to take place. Coming up later on today, we'll be live again after the Saints practice. I have some of my network meetings here at Locked On, so expect the live show to be around like 5:30, something like that, probably more around 5:30. But if I can do it earlier, I will, but probably won't, just based on my schedule. So appreciate you, as always, y'all, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. I thank you to all your everydayers out there, all you first-timers, all you next-timers. Can't do it, wouldn't ever want to do it without you. Appreciate you, as always, for being here. And I thank you for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.